Welcome everyone to the session. The session, I think people are running late. Lunch in this hot weather can be quite. I was also feeling sleepy, so yeah, skipping maybe. Okay, which is a possibility as well. But welcome, and and I think it gives us more time to also go in depth, hopefully, with some of the ideas that we're trying to think about in this process. This session, it's titled Revisiting, Rethinking, Reimagining Ubuntu in Creating Spaces for Transformative Dialogue. And I was asked by Mariki to give a reflection on some of some of the work, the Ubuntu dialogue, the beginning of the Ubuntu dialogue before and open up space to everyone in the panel to contribute as practitioners, as people working in these spaces in various forms, whatever the space is in various forms, and how they're actually thinking about in practice some of the difficult and messy sometimes spaces, but trying to change them at the same time. So I was the former project manager of Ubuntu. So I was just trying to think as I tried to prepare for this, because it became my task now to think about how do I approach this? Do I go all academic route in terms of thinking about how we as a collective, and I'll speak about that as we try to conceptualize this project. When I entered the space, there were people before me, but when I entered the space into something co-creating and becoming active and material, as they say, and this is my mini Marxist in me, the actual way of doing things in the process of it. How do I structure this conversation? And I've been listening to the debate since yesterday in terms of like how people articulate Ubuntu, what does it actually mean, and in various ways. And I'm a Du Boisian scholar, and Du Boisian talks about plexus of social problems. Some are new, some are old, some are simple, some are complex. And this is our history. As history develops, capitalism developed in different ways. It produced all of this. And at the same time, it is part of my history. It is part of my biography as much as it's part of your biography. And to do that, I want you to go with me. Get out of the space of the academy a little bit. Probably will return to it. And I'm going to do that through situating myself, by situating myself outside the space, but within the space as I think through how I arrive to ideas in various ways. So I was born in Kagiso. Those who know Johannesburg, it's in the west of Johannesburg. It's initially, there's a town called Krugersdorp. It's a mining town. And so when gold was discovered in Johannesburg, one of the towns that were built is Krugersdorp. So from that, placing Krugersdorp as a mining town for gold already, you're starting to begin to get a story about capitalism, the curse and the gift of this country and the continent, minerals. What does it bring when we think about minerals in that way? Not only capitalism, exploitation, forced removals, and land dispossession, i.e. Kagiso. But the irony in it, that place that comes from that history became a home at the same time. Brought joy, brought my identity, brought friends, brought family, simultaneously in that plexus of complication. Recently, a year ago, I lost my mother during COVID. In a moment where the world was grieving, my neighbors were grieving as everybody's death. People were dying around us. the space of grieving was also in me. While people, because of the regulations and restrictions, many of my township people also lost their jobs. So poverty was around me. But even in that grieving, my mom's community, my mom's friends, everybody with a mask came, supported me for seven days straight in order to bury my mother. I'm trying to show you that Ubuntu is complex, even in the ugliness. There's still moments of holding space as we become, as we grow, as we rapture, as we mourn, as crisis facing us. People have created communities, and in that grief, I was comforted by the people as they came on the day before the burial, come to chop with me, come to help me in that process. Then traditionally, in my tradition, again, ideas about cosmology, ideas about tradition, culture. My tradition, part of the mourning process, it takes 3 months. So in the 3 months, I had to mourn. Then my uncle had to come after 3 months, slaughter a sheep for me. And that slaughtering that sheep, they take certain organs in it. And as part of breaking my mourning, early in the morning, they mix it with water, all those organs. Early in the morning, my aunt, naked outside, 3 a.m., they had to throw me with that water that is mixed with those organs as part of giving rebirth. Connecting again with the earth in different circumstances. And not complications where we're in the township, we don't have cattle and so on. We have to buy it elsewhere to bring it here. But that connection was still there, was created in its own complication. That is Ubuntu. That is how it works in the most practical sense of what becoming and unbecoming and the making and remaking in the nothingness to become something. Perfect, not necessarily. Holding the I and the we in this process and giving many meanings as history shape us, as reality structure, and many other things shape us. That's how we conceptualize the space. What are the questions when there's nothing in it? What are the questions of Ubuntu when it's used as a tool? What are the questions when it becomes small freedom, as Gil Robo called it? What are the questions when in a moment of lull, as we enter the space in South Africa and in the US, where everything and capitalism is a crude sense, everything is weakening around us. What are the questions? And thinking about the radical nature as we see Black Lives Matter elsewhere, as it merges, and also the contestation in that space versus also here when we see service delivery, fees must fall moment, that radical nature that comes also with Ubuntu, but also comes with the lull as people hide in our poverty, as we are reminded that poverty is your own problem and an individual thing. You become a shell of your own. What becomes Ubuntu? That's what we were trying to do here. I didn't do this alone at all. This project, I was held by Kurt, Masha, as the people, Bongani, I think one of the smartest administrators who guided me, Natasha, she's somewhere around here, was holding me as I navigate the space of administration in the space. That's Ubuntu. As Kurt, I don't know where Kurt is, where he was showing me Cape Town, driving me to these museums and meetings, he helped me. And everyone, Evande, when I actually didn't know anything about technology in the space, he was there. And everybody else, when we had our fellows coming in, all the people in the museum pitching up, having a desk, that chair, moving, water, everybody coming into that space. Mariki, the conversation we had outside, Humla, the center, holding that space, having conversation, debates. That's how it works. This cannot be done alone. in different ways, everybody contributed to this moment and many other moments that shape my life, shape who I am, and shape the collective that we find and we see ourselves in this moment. So when we think about space, when we think about transformative space, sometimes it's the little things, sometimes it's the big things, sometimes it's the small things, sometimes it's the nothingness, the stillness in it as well that we have to think about. And the people who are doing the transformative space outside the academy, inside the academy, I'd like to hear your reflections. What do you think? What are the challenges in creating airspace? Then the challenges in creating a transformative space. I'd like to start with you, Patrina, if you can. Just introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Patrina Chatman. I'm the curator, well, no longer the curator, I'm the director of collections and exhibitions and still do curation. We're a museum of, we have the second largest African-American museum in the country and possibly the world. And our objective is to provide a transformative space. We have 125,000 square feet in different places in that building where different programs can be held, not including exhibits. So in our actuality, we always say, we can take you from baby shower to celebration of death. We've had people who are great people to lay in state in our building. And we've had people like our mayor, first Black mayor of Detroit, Coleman A. Young, laid in state, and thousands. We had Aretha Franklin, if you know that wonderful vocalist. She laid in state at the Charles Wright. And I would say, if it weren't for the fact there were maybe 1 million people came in their pink Cadillacs. Extraordinary times, because it is a place where people feel that it's home. And I'll tell you how that came about. Dr. Charles H. Wright, and that's the museum is named for him, because he is the one who organized the very first 2 buildings, the first one being his own office. He was a physician, he was an obstetrician, and he he actually birthed or brought into the world 7,000 babies. And that's because white doctors would not help him, or he could not go into the white hospitals. However, some of the things that he did very quietly, he was truly a quiet warrior. He made sure that some of those hospitals that would not allow African Americans into their spaces would not get the funding that they thought they were going to get just by writing letters. And that stopped the problems of African Americans not being able to go to other locations where they could be taken care of. This one man, this quiet man, he was always collecting money for the institution. He traveled, though. I have to share this. He traveled a lot. He traveled to Africa. And that's when he got the idea, because it was at a period when the countries were becoming independent. And he saw that what many of the people were doing were collecting their history, collecting their objects so that they could hold on to them and tell those stories to their children and children's children. It came to him, African Americans didn't have museums. He said, we have to make this happen. And that's what he went about doing. In addition to being a physician, in addition to be a father, and he was a part of numerous organizations, this had to happen. So I'll give you a quick story. He was my doctor as well, gynecologist, and I went to see him. He asked me, he asked me about coming to the museum, and I had seen people going into the museum, but they were always in these suits, black and white suits and dressed to the nines. And I saw them, and I was a Black nationalist, and I'm thinking, I'm not going over there. These are all African Americans. They're not for me. But he was my gynecologist. I didn't know he was the founder of the museum. I told him that. He said I should come. I said, no, they're just bougie. That's how we call it instead of bourgeois. They're just bougie. I'm not interested. He talked to me for an hour and a half. In his waiting area were, people waiting to see him, the patients. But he talked to me for an hour and a half, and I'm listening, but I'm kind of not trying not to. When I went out, of course, all of the people who were sitting out there just glared at me, what took you so long? But I had a project to do. Someone asked me to do a project because I was in technical writing. I was not going into the museum field at all. So I'm doing technical writing. Someone asked me to come over to the museum and do this. And I've been there now almost 33 years. It's an astounding kind of life because you're giving back to your community. You learn what your community wants, what they need. I'll give you one example about community, two, if you will. One, we had a wonderful, we had an exhibition documenting African Americans being brought here, brought to the United States as enslaved people. The guy who designed it painted all of the African Americans on the ship gray. And many of them were laying back, kind of laid back, like they were actually on a cruise ship. Well, when people came in to see the exhibit, they didn't like it. They come directly to you and they said, I hate that exhibition, because now these are the people who help raise money for these institutions, for the buildings. Some of them raise money by donating pennies. It was the penny campaign, and it came from the students in schools. They raised $17,000 worth of pennies. This was their museum. So we had to tear that museum, that exhibit out and change it to reflect what African Americans in Detroit wanted to see and be a part of. And when we did this time, instead of just building this exhibit, we brought them in and got their opinions. Instead of just saying we're going to do this, we realized this community is part and parcel to our future. They came in and they told us things such as, we don't want to start as, this exhibition as if slavery occurred from the beginning. We want to show African American peoples of African descent building or being a part of their own lives, showing that there was history before there was their story. And we did that. Since that time, we've had people coming and bringing their families, questioning when they saw a problem. For example, we had Thomas Jefferson. Okay, Thomas Jefferson, you all know, was the president. He was a slave owner. We were forced to have the exhibit by a board member. And I kept telling him, this is not the kind of exhibit for this community. It's not going to work. Told him twice, told him 3 times. He went down to Thomas Jefferson's plantation, got permission to bring the exhibit, got paid for it, brought it to the Charles Wright. I put Thomas Jefferson in the back, because he was painted in all gold. He stood there proud, and he would have he was flanked by the names of the enslaved. I put him in the back. That's all I could do because we had to do this, right? People got wind of it. In 50 years, the museum has always been totally connected to the community, except for that one exhibit. They boycotted the Charles H. Wright Museum. Unbelievable tears, from them, tears from us, because we knew the community. So I think that's very important in terms of looking at this as transformative dialogue and transformative spaces. We have to, at minimally, know who our community is, what they want, and how they want it, so that we are doing our jobs.
Thank you for that. Space reflecting the community that we're living in.
Thank you. This whole conference has just been mind-blowing. And what I will say is that when I think of Ubuntu, I don't think of a thing. I think of a mindset. I think it is a way of being. So I've been grappling with this before this conference. Is Westerners capitalization are very astute at co-opting language, co-opting strength, and kind of dismantling community. Very astute and very subtle at it. And so I have to question myself, how implicitly am I going along with that sometimes as I start talking about Ubuntu, because I'm African American. Didn't hear the term up until a few years ago. I teach incarcerated men and women in our county facility once a week. And I take this concept. We were talking about being invisible, being not a person. There is no greater place where that makes its presence than the incarcerated people, particularly in the United States, who has the most draconian prison system in the world. Over the last 20 years, it's doubled. Mass incarceration has doubled in the last 20 years. It has doubled, probably quadrupled for people of color and people in poverty. When I say they're locked away, and people in the county facilities say, prison is much better than this. They don't get recreation. They don't, their visits. And I'm just gonna ask your hand, how many people have somebody here that's incarcerated currently? How many have somebody that's had a family member or a friend that's been incarcerated? Okay. One of every three, how many people have been incarcerated? Yeah, thank you. One out of every 3 people in the United States will have a criminal record if they're people of color. One of every 3 Black men will be incarcerated. Not will be incarcerated, are incarcerated. So when I go to the jail and I say, I am because you are. I am trying to bring a concept that is completely foreign. And sometimes I feel less than happy about that. And until I see what the transformation is, just by being recognized as a human, as a person. That alone is transformative. We can dialogue all day long about what it is and what it ain't. But when you treat someone, and we can get real cliche, the way you want to be treated, we don't have to really make it that deep sometimes. Because I often think, I tell them, but by the grace of God, I'm not here. It's really, I haven't done anything really different. Now, mind you, when we were talking about humanizing people, when I first went to the jail, I thought it was like, okay, this is a 90-day sentence for little minor crimes like blah, blah, driving drunk or getting caught with a little bit, and they're not here forever. Well, some of the people are there for years until they post bond or have trial. Without access to children, visits that they don't do any personal visits, it's all prompt. It's all usually teleprompt. I mean, I could go on about how horrific it is, but what I want to say is that from my standpoint of recognizing and understanding what Ubuntu is, it's a mindset, and it is completely about my responsibility to and for other humans. So that's the I am because you are. That's my responsibility. And I know we've got a lot of people, so I'll just stop.
Thank you so much, Greta, for that. I mean, one of the most important thing, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, okay, because there's a G, so my head is like, okay. Around the idea of recognition in a limited space, in a confined space where nobody recognizes you, is very powerful. Leslie, if you can go ahead.
Thanks, Mosa. I thought I had something to say until just before your introduction, and you changed my pattern completely. Perhaps a good thing, Mosa. No, that was very good. I'm Leslie van Rooi. I'm from this university, Stellenbosch University. I'm the senior director responsible for social impact and transformation. And I think I was invited to this panel, Ricky, etc., given my role also as co-responsible for name changes and symbols and visual redress. And I have to leave in an hour to meet transformation managers to walk over campus to see some of the symbols. I thought I'd start with the story of space. I have an interesting relation with this building. There's one of the lecturers, Ashwin, very interesting relation with the building. Like Wilhelm, I studied here. Wilhelm studied here 40 years ago, and I started here 22 years ago. So a bit of a different generation, but a very interesting year. It was the first year that students of color from a different denomination was allowed to study here. A very interesting experience. Students from the University of the Western Cape studied here. Now, of course, there were individual students allowed, students of color were allowed to study here from the 80s. It was the first time that a large cohort of students moved from a historically black university to a historically white university into the space. Now, the space is a very interesting space, Mosa. It is a very old space. The church that you see across from here, the congregation, is 366 years old, which is relatively old in a context like this. And one of the first buildings in this town, formal structures as we know buildings now, was built here. Now, this historically used to be an island. Where the First Nations people of South Africa in this region stayed. The river that you see at the back surrounded this space, and you could be safe, of course, on an island. And the original walls of the structures in the phase right after the, shall I call it, the reconfiguration of the town is still here, Ashwin. I don't know if you know, right at the back. This building housed the first magistrate of this region, the structure, must I change? And the first police station was right next door. The first school was started right across from here, but this building was the judicial home for many years. Now, you would think that I would know this history for someone who studied at this building or in this building for 10 years. But I really only found out about this history well after I left. And I found out a number of other things, which is what will bring me to the strange role that I have. And that is that a number of runaway slaves at the stage were kept underneath this building from farms in and around Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch had, outside of Cape Town, the largest slave population in this area of what is now South Africa. You would think that we would know this history, but we really don't know this history. And then secondly, I found out, and I see some of our former students are here, perhaps they are still students. They look around now. But in 2015, we had a national student protest, which in the end, which started by at the University of Cape Town, a protest that started around the Rhodes statue. Now, Rhodes for the American visitors is a bit like Jefferson, I suppose, in the context of South Africa, the big miner with a lot of money that, in his mind, owned most of this part of the world. And the statue was toppled, and it grew from a Rhodes Must Fall movement into a number of varieties of the movement in the context of Stellenbosch, the Open Stellenbosch movement, and later on a National Fees Must Fall movement. And one of the effects of the movement was to make sure that we realize as we realized as a bit of a shock in 2000, that the walls of places and spaces talk. Our very renowned and now late rector, Russell Botman, said if you walk into a space, and he was referring to this space, you could hear the walls talk, and it most definitely was not your language. It wasn't your sense. It didn't feel as if it was yours. And during the protest, what students did, I thought very strikingly, was they took some of the photos that used to be on these walls, and they were class photos from the 1800s up to 2015 or 2014, I suppose, and turned the photos around that had individuals on that was seen as historically highly problematic. They left the photos, turned them around, and when the lecturers walked in the next day, they realized that clearly something's happening. Brilliant way of protesting. The photos, of course, had on some of the apartheid ideas and brains that studied here and specifically was associated with this building and space. And later on, as you would see down the corridor, that is no longer. You would think that one would know this when you study here or before you study here, but I found that out much later. Perhaps Ashwin, the students these days are much better with history of space and place. My role on university is strongly connected with that. Since 1989, this university has started to remove symbols, specifically busts of former prime ministers and later presidents of the apartheid era. Started with the most obvious name changes. All but one of the prime ministers of the apartheid regime studied here. And as you can imagine, some of the spaces were named after them. And since the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, that started to change. It really deeply only started to take strong effect when we were reminded by students in 2015 and 16 that you might think that you change, but you look and smell and feel like your past. And only since then have we formally, as a university, through policy and through engagement, forced change in, amongst other symbols and names, in a much more proactive way. I want to end on the engagement note, just to say, Mosa, that in any of these changes, I've realized that you can take away a name and change a symbol, etc. But if you don't do it in an engaged way, and if you don't allow enough input also from the voices that historically would not have had input in the process, you change very little. Now that, of course, has a downside, and that is that it takes 6 months to a year to engage and allow for opportunities, but inherently that is the upside. It becomes public experience and public space, which is the nature of a public university. And at one of those engagements, when we changed the name of the university's theater from the name of a staunch nationalist to a anti-apartheid poet, we had a group of visitors from a variety of communities, including Stellenbosch, and I deliberately used the word visitor because she described herself as a visitor, who entered the space as part of the engagements, and she said she has just retired as a primary school teacher, 65 in the case of South Africa. She's lived in Stellenbosch for all of her life, and it is the first time that she set foot in a university building. But more so, it is the first time that she felt it is not only about being in the space, but that the space acknowledges the fact that you are human and can be in a space that now has a name of someone that you associate with. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I mean, the takeaway here is to think about change. As we change space, what do we uncover? What has not been told about our history? What has been told about our history? Whether the change is there. Kiya?
Thank you. My name is Kiya Green, and I bring with me my Ubuntu story, which begins with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu But I also bring with me my maternal grandmother, who is 101 years old, someone who has always said, you are a person that can, you are a person that does. I bring with me I'm sorry, she's my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother, Barbara Dean, who is someone who has always said, love anyway. My father, who has transitioned, but has always said, you are somebody, you will be somebody. And my mother, who is just my greatest cheerleader. But aside from my voice, I'm a former public schools educator in the city of Trenton in New Jersey. I resigned to homeschool my children. And then through creating my family mission for our homeschool, which included Ubuntu Village, restoring the dignity of them as Black males in American society, grounding them in character education, and also instilling the importance of kindness to self and also to others. As an independent educator and homeschooling mom, I found lots of families that could tie into this mission that I defined for my own. And so I began to include other students in my humble homeschool at home. I created a classroom in my basement for my children and others, but then that extended to teaching students online. And so through working with my own children and students that were homeschooled in different states, right? And we would meet virtually. I had this sense of creating community between us all. And Mosa, when you shared about, keeping space and aligning with both the I and the we, I feel like the pledge that I want to share with you from the voices of my children, because I feel so very strongly to share the voices of children in this space. It was such a powerful activity of not just learning the what, but learning the how. And that's really where I practitioner as an educator as it relates to Ubuntu is the how I educate, how I work with children. And so in creating this sense of community, we started to think about, or I encouraged them to think about, how is community created in traditional educational institutions? Most of the time it's, it's the Pledge of Allegiance, right? You might sing the Black National Anthem, but there's some sort of likely, pledge or some sort of recitation of something that's going to bring unity. And so we did some background work. What's the history of the Pledge of Allegiance? What's the history of the Star Spangled Banner? What are the lyrics of the Black National Anthem? What are some other pledges that we can find, that we can read, and that would be the symbol of unifying us across, Connecticut, Kentucky, Maryland, Georgia, New Jersey. We need to find this rhythm, this community between us all, right? So my students, which are 3rd through 8th graders, we contemplated them all. We looked through the history. We read the intentions of them. We read the lyrics, and none of them fit. They said, none of these work for us. We feel like at our institution, Ubuntu Village, these do not qualify us. And so I said, well, it sounds like you're going to have to write your own. And that night, it probably was the only assignment that every single student from 3rd through 8th grade completed, and early. before the time that it was due. I mean, they were very excited about writing their own pledge. The assignment was for you to write at whatever level your skill set allows you. You know, the more accomplished writers, the older students, they had plenty, you know, paragraphs. You know, the younger students, maybe they had a few sentences. However, everyone took on this ownership of creating a sense of what is it that I will be able to stand up and say in the mirror, and I will believe in this. This is what I can believe in. And so the next day, because I call, you know, we are a community of learners. We are a community of learners, and everyone has to show up in that space, willing to take risks, willing to share, willing to learn, willing to be challenged. And so they did. Everyone had their assignments in, and through the Zoom platform, we all know we can share our screens, and we were able to, every student was able to read their pledge. And so that evening, I literally wept while and these are their words, and I'm gonna share them with you. But what I did was I saw trends. I saw trends throughout their pledges, their personal pledges, the I, right? So I saw trends, but then I saw also individuality, uniqueness. There were some things in Anaya's pledge that were different from Samir's pledge, that were different from Gary's pledge. And so I took the unique lines so that everyone would find themselves. And then I also embedded the trends within, so that they would identify with the commonality, right? And so at the onset, everything was I, from you know, everyone's singular point of view. But I will tell you that because there was still conversation around this, because they had to agree on a title. They brainstormed titles. They, you know, what's the title of this? They, you know, they had a process of elimination. And they also decided, because I started out with the I's, and they also decided to change it to we. And this is their pledge. We will embrace our Blackness by the Ubuntu Village Scholars. We are who we say we are. We are the drivers of our education. We sit in the driver's seat. We will not only train our bodies, but we will train our minds. We are attentive learners and precise note takers. We take responsibility to commit ourselves to putting in our best efforts. We will ask for help when needed, yet we will never doubt ourselves. We practice patience, discipline, and humility. We pray at our sacred spaces. We use the virtues of Ma'at to guide our lives. Truth, justice, righteousness, order, balance, harmony, reciprocity, and knowledge, but never forgetting the virtue of love. We use the principles of Kwanzaa. We make our brothers and sisters' problems our own problems. We solve them together. We build our own businesses and profit together. We use our brains and creativity at all costs. We will work to make peace in the world, although there may be times when we need to be brave and fight. We will always be a part of the Black culture. Our descendants will be proud of our legacy. One day, we will be ancestors too. We claim our African heritage and culture, the best and worst of its history. We are African people. And those are the voices of my Ubuntu scholars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiya. I mean, writing our own histories, what space does it create as well? And I think that's such an important aspect as well. Mandy?
Hi, so I'm Mandy Sang. I head education at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town. It's a small museum that was formed during the resistance to apartheid, when displacement was a significant part of shaping how people were allowed to be in the city. And so the process of divide and rule was a mechanism, a political tool used very effectively in the management and experience of apartheid. So our museum exists to start engaging in public dialogues with kids from early learning centers to postgraduates, students, community-based organizations, activists dealing with issues related to social justice and human rights as it continues to manifest in society today. We've had a democracy for 27, 28 years, but for the great majority of people in this country, they still exist under conditions that were created by colonialism and apartheid. So our domestic workers still work within a power relation that was developed during colonialism, the Master-Servant Act. It's no longer on the books, but the way people perceive domestic workers is still very much in that way. Our farm workers, people who exist in the places to which they were forcibly removed. For the great majority of those people, the apartheid conditions still exist. How they're able to move through the city, access to places of education, culture is still very much a distant reality for many people. And so that's basically the, just to understand the context within which we do our museum education work. And so from the outset, the District 6 Museum imagined itself as a space for transformative dialogue. We have worked very hard to render this idea and concept as a lived reality and everyday experience. And to do that means you have to be accepting of multiple perspectives. You have to really destroy in some ways or disrupt the walls that exist between a museum and the public. So it's not only engaging in these difficult dialogues in what is called safe spaces where it can be done comfortably. We have to a large extent from our outset, and we're in existence for about 28 years now, 29 years if you include the fact that during apartheid we were part of civil society resisting apartheid. So we've always had to embrace the idea of engaging in what is called difficult dialogues. Accepting that, progressive ideas or transformed ideas don't emerge automatically. We're not born with it. It evolves. And the way in which it evolves and emerges as woke, is a difficult process. You can't cleanse that process. You can't force it to be born when you wanted to be born. There are lots of steps you take moving forward, and you've got to take steps back again and reassess the situation. You have to welcome people into the space who differ with you, who you perceive to be different politically. And so we've really made that our mission, and we've tried to live it. It's been incredibly uncomfortable, particularly for a person like myself. I'm from the Steve Biko era, I'm from that Biko generation, so there's nobody on this planet who can tell me I'm not black. I'm Biko black. Okay. And so it's very difficult for me to engage with people who perceive themselves to be colored. You know, it's a, yet I've got to be accepting of the fact that people enter into our space with their consciousness, with their lived experience, which they don't share with me necessarily. They might be younger, they might be much older, they might come from a different political experience. So that's our starting point for engaging in what we call transform dialogue. And we've had to accept sometimes, not accept, but we've had to welcome people into our spaces who were part of Kufut. For those of you who don't know, Kufut is one of the biggest um, uh, terrorist organizations in the history of this country. Tortured, they were part of the, they were brought before the TRC and they tortured anti-apartheid activists. You know, some of them were responsible for roasting anti-apartheid activists. But when parents who are openly Kufut come to our museum with schools and in the company of other young people, we have to demonstrate to young people that we can challenge these regressive ideas in a way that by proving that our ideas are better in a sense. And so it's very uncomfortable, but we have to do it. We've come to the realization, therefore, that it's not just about content, it's about form. So how you engage in these dialogues. So I'm very uncomfortable talking in this kind of space. You know, we normally talk in circles, not talk in circles, sorry. We engage in the form of circles, etc. And we've come to the realization that a humanizing pedagogy is the only type of space you can create for transformative dialogues. You've got to see the person you differ with as human first. And so there are certain characteristics to us that's very important in terms of the spaces and the places that we engage in. And it's both inside the museum as well as outside, and it's also in the township. That's where we exist as a museum. And the first thing is kindness as a starting point. But to keep in mind that kindness doesn't look the same everywhere. So for instance, in a culture, a community culture I come from, when we deal with someone we differ with, and that person's incredibly irritating, hard to deal with, we use the ironic phrase, diapers when here a clap. Now, to somebody, literally that's violent. But in our culture, it just means that person needs some truth telling. You know, needs to be told some fundamental truth. And so telling truths, giving negative feedback in positive ways to people is an act of kindness as well. You know, we're helping them along their growth, along their evolution. Facilitation and mediation of difficult dialogues is required, but sometimes this is not always planned. So how do you create a culture in your organization where everybody perceives themselves to be a facilitator or a mediator of difficult dialogue, whether it happens in a way that you haven't planned for. So we have difficult people coming into the museum who says, why are we talking about apartheid? Leave it, it's still in the past. How do you facilitate that conversation in a way that allows others in the vicinity to learn? So you're not really concerned about that negative person or changing that person, but we're constantly aware of who else is around and how we engage in dialogue. And then the presentation, clarification, and acceptance of nuanced concepts. I think we're living in an era where the internet and social media has really changed how we see concepts and words. they become binary, right? People no longer ask people to explain what they mean when they use particular concepts. So if I describe myself as black and I encounter someone who says, "Oh, I'm colored," we don't take time to stop and say, "What do you mean by that?" We engage in very self-righteous ways. Right? And so I constantly have to reflect on myself and say, but when you say that, what do you mean? Because for me, it's a trigger. You know, if somebody says to me, they colored my generation, you know, having been incarcerated, political prisoner, when somebody says they colored, it triggers in me. I automatically think this person was complicit with apartheid. And so I've had to really deal with how do I step back and ask people what they mean. They're not the same people calling themselves colored as did in the good old days of apartheid. And then I'm concluding now. Oh, sorry. Oh, but get those multi-directional mics. And then just the last point that we've tried to also, instill this idea of active listening. It's come to mean that you're silent. You listen and you never present your views. And for us in our space, it's important for no one to be silent. You know, people need to engage. It's how we engage that's very important. We've tried to also, and this has also become very difficult, particularly with the United States culture being the dominant and hegemonic culture in the world. We've tried to hold the idea that humor, irony is fundamental to how we present ourselves to each other in the world. Right? We don't just present ourselves to each other in intellectual ways. We present ourselves as the whole human being. And we've got to recognize that in that presentation, there has to be space for humor, for irony. And George Orwell is very important here. He wrote mainly during a horrific period in history, the Holocaust period of great darkness. And there's one poem he writes, he says, in times of darkness shall we laugh? And then he says, yes, in times of darkness we shall laugh. And very often the most marginalized, the most vulnerable people in the world have found their resilience through humor, right? Through being able to lift themselves up and look at their situation in ways that is humorous. It's not laughing at others, it's laughing with. It's been able to unlock ways of talking about difficult issues with people who are not engaged in academic or intellectual discussion as an everyday part of their lives. And those are the people who are more important to us at the District 6 Museum than other academics or intellectuals. It's the people who are not engaged in the discussions that are important. And then finally, care requires both sensitivity and resilience in a dialectical way. People talk about, creating transformative spaces as if you must be sensitive or resilient. You can be both. And I think we have to really think about those. So the idea of progressiveness, wokeness, and critical thinking is developed over time, always in the company of others, and it's never settled, right? It's never settled. So it's a permanent struggle. And I'd like to conclude with that. So lots more to say.
No, I didn't know either. Thank you so much, Mandy, for that. I mean, what I'm taking away from this is how do we create a space that is welcoming with all different thoughts coming together and also learning from everyone with the messiness and beautiful things as well. Geraldine.
Thank you, Mandy. My name is Geraldine Friesler. I'm the curator of research, dialogue, and social justice at the Stellenbosch University Museum. So a lot of what both Leslie and Mandy said, I will skip through that and not rehash that as well. I think I will start off with the challenges of creating spaces for dialogue and then try and end off on a more positive note by giving some guidelines as how to navigate and creating those spaces. For me, I found museums are political spaces, and for that reason, we should try and create them as dialogical spaces as well. It should be those contact spaces for inclusion, because it is fraught with inclusion and participation as we collectively grapple with questions of decoloniality, Mandy, racism and social inequalities, and so forth. And in creating those spaces for dialogue, it is important to be open, reflexive, and intentional in order to have those meaningful engagements. And just going to talk, Mandy actually reminded me that as I was sitting here, and it's of no fault of anybody's, it's just placement of the chairs, I was feeling uncomfortable too. And so thank you for acknowledging, I think, your own and my discomfort, because it does feel, even though it's it's an informal discussion, but it does feel a bit like talking down to people as well. And that is something, you know, in my approach to my work, it's something that I'm very mindful of. So thank you for that, Mandy. So, and more than that is to practice active listening, but also to understand that I bring my own subjectivities into it. And as museum professionals, I think it's safe to say that we are moving away from our own perceptions that we are neutral, when in fact, you know, our work cannot be neutral. In fact, if you are neutral, there is a problem because of your own your own lived experience that you bring to your work, your own subjectivities, and how that informs your work as well. So, and in this way, we should also be open in creating spaces that have provide the space to have different perspectives and experiences, and to offer a supportive space in that sense, by also acknowledging your own discomfort and others' discomfort when dealing with contentious issues, or what Mandy also referred to as trigger issues. But creating those spaces are not often easy, I have found, at least. And this is for a number of reasons. The first being when we are looking at specifically a university with a museum within a university, academic institutions are often likened, and I've been at least at 3 academic institutions, both as student, both in my professional capacity. They are often likened to these big bureaucratic ships that move steadily. And that means that often it's slow to turn with the tide. And this approach has seemingly worked for a while. And like Leslie said earlier, it has worked, but also not really, because we've seen the hashtag roads must fall, and then later the fees must fall movements, and also Black Lives Matter on a more global level. And then, of course, the counter responses in the form of more bolder forms now of right-wing extremism and increased populism, national populism. So that is one. But any institution is also made up of individuals in this room, students, academics, museum professionals, people that work for NGOs. And we must collectively, individually and collectively, push for transparency, push for dialogue, push for accountability and social justice when it comes to things like access, public programming, staffing, policies, collection strategies in the case of museums, exhibition and displays, the interpretation of exhibitions, and engagement and the increase to wider audiences. Lastly, it is to think about our collective complicity, my own complicity in upholding and endorsing museum practices that were founded on a colonial blueprint and the associated knowledge systems that comes with it, and the funding regimes in existence that are often dictated by a confluence of Western imperatives and co-option. So in terms of how I approach my work is to have an intentional and a meaningful approach to thinking about how I can create transformative spaces in terms of dialogue, to think about the stories that needs to be told, that I want to be told, and about the need that still exists to draw out the hidden, the marginalized, and the unheard voices. And to have this constructive dialogue, both through my PhD research and also through work assignments, I have learned that when I was doing oral history interviews with communities, for example, is what Mandy also spoke about, is to seek to understand before you seek to be understood. So often we go in as researchers, knowing your research question in your mind, and that's all you are after. And you're not really listening. You're not listening to your community. And that then translates into an exhibition that does not speak to the community, that does not speak to the needs of the community. And we have various examples of that in South Africa. A big one that comes to mind is the one in Gqeberha, which it's in a township, the Red Location Museum. Lots of controversy around it, no community engagement, consultation. So things like that. So that, the concept of Ubuntu, how did that shape? Was it even, entertained when that museum was thought of? And it's, for me, I think the most important part of it is to be empathetic, to have that kind of empathy, and to intentionally transform the dynamics that have given shape to what the museum looks like today, and how we can transform that. And then I will end off now. Something that Leslie actually reminded me at the beginning also is body language. Very important. I was sitting like this with my arms crossed. And, I didn't realize that. And Leslie asked me, "Are you cold?" So small things like that, that sometimes we take for granted, but it's about learning and listening and practicing and being attentive. And anecdotally, I will just share this with you. As a last resort, if all else fails, anecdotally, I always think about the iconic words of Bob Marley and the Wailers in Redemption song, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind." And I mean, that has just been a refrain from myself. Both when I was studying, I began here in 1997 at Stellenbosch University. Finally graduated here with an honors in international relations. And I never thought I would come back to Stellenbosch. Kind of a, love-hate relationship, which is a story for another day. But I'm here. And since then, I mean, that has been my refrain. and you really can. But this work, it does come at a cost. And it's something that on a personal level, I've debated with myself. But the conclusion that I've come to is that it should come at a cost, because that's the work of transformative and activist work. If it does not come at a cost, you're not doing it right. You should be feeling it. You know, there is no rest for that in terms of that. It's like Mandy said, for the wicked, yes. It never ends. It's all over. So it's a struggle and it continues. So I will leave you with that uplifting words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, for that. I mean, what I'm taking away also in all of this, it's like bureaucracy and creating spaces as well. You talked about the red tape in that space. And what does it mean for Ubuntu as well? I'm going to open up the space to everybody to share as we practice, as we shape these institutions, as we create these spaces in different ways. So, yes, Precious. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. So just start. Okay. I'll just go according to the rate of hands. No, yeah, apparently you have to use this net and you have to hold it. Sorry, there's like a don't hold it here. Hold it here. Okay. Thank you for those submissions. I have a quick question for Leslie. Because you said you're going to leave early, and then another one maybe for Mandy, Chatman, maybe Geraldine. Leslie, my question for you is around institutional agility. How is it that when it comes to issues of transformation, institutions are so slow to change? I mean, the timeline that you've given us from the time that you were a student up to now, the issues that have been present at Stellenbosch, how is it that the issues that you went through, concerns that you were aware of and some that you are not, are still issues that are still there, and possibly maybe if your children come and study here, they will find here. And yet we saw the institution was very agile during COVID. Decisions were made at a pace that we had never seen before. Meetings were prioritized and deans called in because, I don't know, for some criteria, because there was a red alert on it. So can you comment on institutional agility? Because before we thought the message was always, it's a big ship, it takes time to turn. But this ship turned really fast over COVID. Can it turn really fast for transformational issues, for changing space? And then the other question that I had for the ladies was, again, and this is a personal interest of mine, on the issue of archiving. At what level is archiving in the hands of the curator, and at what level is it in the hands of the institution, particularly for a museum that falls under a university like yours? Where does your power lie? Because again, if we look at the history of Stellenbosch, I've only been here for about 4.5 years, but we've drastically seen changes in what is curated in that space. So what about that is because the people are changing, and what about that is maybe because the times are changing, or maybe is it the institution that is changing? That changes how we archive and what we deem archivable. Maybe I hope that question is clear. Okay, for logistic reasons, I think I will go this way without order. I think. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much again for your time on this panel. I wanted to ask what you touched on lastly about the fact that no one should be silent in these spaces. And I find it hard to interpret when people choose not to speak, choose not to share. I find it hard to accept. And at times I find myself wondering what type of tactics you can use to get someone who feels like there's nothing they need to share to open up, because I noticed in classroom spaces, typically with people who aren't as close to you or don't know you as well, that it's difficult to feel like this is going to progress if we continue to run into silence or lack of comment. I wanted to see if you all know how to allow people to embrace their thoughts and feelings and emotions and stray away from the option that you don't have to say something sometimes. I know that sometimes it can get emotional or maybe it's too hard to let out. And I think we experienced that last evening with our stories and our objects. But I think we have a lot to say and a lot to grow in, especially with people who choose to be in the space. So if you guys have any recommendations, I'd appreciate it.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My question is about tactics as well. You mentioned, areas where pushes need to happen, right? And I'd like to open it to the whole panel. What are some pushes? What are some tactics that you used in your work that have worked to create the kind? Because sometimes, you're pushing and you might be pushing in the wrong direction, pushing against, immovable, whatever, but what are some things that you've done in your work that has worked for you?
There's no one on the side, ne? Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay. Yes, I'll come to you. Like, yeah, like just the what? You're covered. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yes. I don't know. Like apparently. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I have okay. All right. Can everybody still hear me? No?
No. Hello? Okay, you have two.
Okay. All right. All right, good. Okay, I have a question for three of the panelists. Okay. The first question for Ms. Kiya Green is I know it's the name of your school, Ubuntu Village Homeschool, and is your school, I guess, an Afrocentric school? And if it is, what makes it Afrocentric? And how do you think that the name of the school, using the African word, is beneficial to the students, and how do they take that in? And then my question for Ms. Mandy Sanger is, what do you think Steve Biko's message, really was in a nutshell, in a kind of an African way? I think sometimes Steve Biko is sort of under spotlighted in certain ways as a part of the South African struggle. And my last question is for Ms. Patrina Chatman, regarding the Charles Wright Museum. How do you think its role, along with maybe other African American museums, would be in shaping the narrative of African Americans in the United States toward global Africa?
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a lot of questions. Does that work? Okay. Okay.
Hello.
Okay. For practical reasons, I'll let Leslie to speak first because he has to leave fairly soon. Then, yeah, whoever comes second, it's up for grabs.
So let me make two remarks first. The first is, I mean, Wilhelm said it yesterday, the space is fundamentally different. I mean, it looks different. The people who walk in these corridors are different. What is taught is different in the space, etc. My argument is more towards, if you want to truly understand and implement something of a decolonial thinking, and space might help you with that. That is my point. So use the space and the story of the space to help you with that. But I mean, this space, yeah, Ashwin must comment on where it is now, but I cannot compare it to the time that I was here. I can compare some of the other struggles on campus. That is indeed so. The second remark I want to make is around COVID. I'm not too sure if it was a fast decision. I think there's a difference between an emergency decision and a proper change. And the most feeling sensitive experience that I had during COVID was we went into a meeting, an emergency meeting on the day after the president of South Africa called for lockdown, shutdown rather, lockdown. What was it called? Wasn't context difference. The one in the one country it was lockdown, the other one shut down. This one was lockdown. And we had an emergency meeting and there was a decision to literally close this university. Now for context, it was the first time in the history of this university that it closed. It didn't close during the 1918 influenza pandemic. It didn't close during the First and Second World Wars. During the student protests of 2015 16, it stopped classes for an afternoon. It did not close. This was the first time that this institution closed. And then we entered a very interesting debate. And this is why I don't think you should, I don't think what happened during Christmas Fall was real change. We had to fight to keep the residences open because it was quite clear that for a number of students, it wasn't as simple as just going home. Our students could not go home, they couldn't afford to go home. If they went home, they would not have access to any form of education, material. It could also be that if you go home to a country different than South Africa, returning in that state of emergency would not be possible. And it was decided the university should shut down, it should close. And I remember the anger and vigor in that meeting to decide that all 45 of the university's residents will stay open. And then we were warned, you can keep it open, but there will be no services. Now, no services means no food, no cleaning, no services. And of course, that's understandable to a certain degree. We were in lockdown, it could not happen. Staff could not come in. But it was a bit of almost a, you can do this, but it's on your own watch and something will go wrong. And we had to decide to make it work with the students, for example, that stayed in a residence. And then I realized, and one of my colleagues is watching, I think she's still watching. We had a very interesting period then. And then I realized that this changes, you can bring about certain fast track changes, but I'm not sure whether it's fundamental or not. I'm not too sure if it brings about fundamental change. And I don't think COVID has brought about fundamental change. The only fundamental change COVID has brought is this machine. And we're not going to use it in lecture rooms as often as we did during COVID. The camera that I see, so I'm not sure about that. What does bring about fundamental change is a deliberateness, and this is to another question, deliberateness and openness, and I would say personal pain of individuals that will allow processes to become almost automized. Now, you know, in a university, those of you in university administration would know, a president or a vice chancellor or a rector can really say what he or she wants. I mean, it is not an ex cathedra type of decision. That rarely works in an institution as big as an institution. It is mostly a group of people, a committee or an official decision that will allow an action. If you have, and that is where I've seen deeper change, if you have individuals that understand that an ethos must change, that you must be a better university, that you must inherently make right what was wrong in the past, and that making right looks like this, then overturning and allowing deeper change. And there are examples here in some of our students and staff in this room. Then deeper change is possible. but you have to hone that. You have to make sure that the environment and the culture allows that. You have to make sure that there is enough safeness and openness to allow something new and something very deliberate. And that, I think, brings about a much faster process, much deeper, and therefore also faster process of change. And then I must understand that the first year, the freshmen that will arrive on this campus on the 1st of February 2023 will be new. So in the story of re-engineering and redoing and working, for example, with students, etc., 20% of that will be fresh and new on the 1st of February in 2023. You have to do it again. You have to go through the process again. You have to make sure that you in culture and reculture and I suppose social engineer differently and do it in these big institutions over and over and over. There's no kingship. There's no magic wand. It has to re-gear itself over and over. I think and I hope to the point that it is automized to the extent that understands that it is universal. That is the nature of a university. This one is public. It must allow its publicness to come through much stronger, and it must be responsive. And inherently, if you are responsive, you understand something of the need and the necessity to bring about valuable change and have a positive impact. I think.
Thank you. I realize that maybe I could be wrong. As we move our little jury, it makes a sound. So I think if we can try to hold it a bit more still, maybe, I don't know, there's less sound. Yes, we are experimenting. We're creating a space of technology as well.
So can you hear me? Hello? Okay. I didn't quite get your whole question that you wanted to ask of me.
So, okay.
Regarding the Charles Wright Museum as an African American museum. Still can't? Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. My question was, with your being with the Charles Wright Museum as an African American museum and other African American and other African American.
Use your football field voice.
Okay.
Use your mic. And the
All right,
football field.
Can everybody hear me? I know I have a loud voice. Nobody can still hear me. Okay. All right. All right. So my question was, with your being being with the Charles Wright Museum as an African American museum, along with other African American museums, how critical do you think those institutions are in shaping the narrative of African American people to other people in the global, global Africa?
And thank you. So what we've done is we tell the stories. We tell stories. I think that's the best way, if everyone can hear me, we tell stories. It's the best way to inform people. It's something our great-great-grandparents have done, and it works. It works in schools. So what we do is if we choose a topic, for example, 67, what they call 67 riots. You may have or may not have heard of it, but it tore the city of Detroit apart, burned down much of the city, and there was a reason for that. The reason that the people turned against the city people in charge, let's just say, it was because they weren't being heard. They were being moved out of the spaces where they lived, and there was no place for them to go. They would be put into situations that were ridiculous. They would move into an apartment that normally housed one family, maybe 2 bedrooms, and that apartment would be cut in half to house 2 families. The jobs were going away. They would hire, of course, white people over, and if Black people were already working, they would be laid off and, things of that nature. So there was a situation that occurred in the Black community. Two brothers came home from Vietnam, and they were going to have a party celebrating the fact that they survived it. And then the police, who were frightening, and I do recall these frightening people who would walk up on you and just, and treat you badly. They decided that they were going to crash it. They were going to go in and arrest everybody. Well, it was a very quiet kind of thing going on. It wasn't a real problem, but the way they came in and dragged them out of the building, the whole community started coming out, and they decided that enough was enough. Somebody threw one bottle, and it happened to have been the owner of the building, who was happened to be Black, and his son. It was his son who threw that bottle. That bottle lit the whole city, almost the whole city of Detroit up, and it burned down areas where you wouldn't believe. Beautiful homes, where some Black people were able to live, other places that were just horrible. So what we did that was in 1967. So in 2007, everybody in the community, in the cultural center, including the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is the 5th largest art museum in the country, the Detroit Historical Museum, all came together to recognize that period and what happened, with the hope of telling that story and making sure it didn't happen again. What we did was we declared it a rebellion. Okay, so now we've declared a rebellion. No one really calls it that. People who were around and who were elderly called it a riot. We contacted through our education department 100 professors to ask them, based on what the information we had, what was it, a riot or rebellion? Out of the 100, 99 said it was a rebellion. They said it was a rebellion because not only did Detroit rebel, there were almost 300 other cities in the United States that rebelled similarly, some smaller, less, damage, and others almost equal. So those are the things you find out. You get the history, you share it with the people. I did an exhibition on lynching, which included photographs of people who had been lynched. Some white Americans were doing what they called, they were collecting stuff to sell, and they found that a lot of white Americans had these lynching photos. So this is something that's really difficult, right? It's a story to tell, though. We have to tell our stories. So I put that whole exhibit up, and we announced it. People came looking for their family members. So we know the kind of history that we have to tell. We have to tell the stories. We don't tell them in a way that tries to hurt people or anything, but the stories have to be told. We are the place to tell the story. Now, I want you to understand that I told you about the Detroit Institute of Art being the largest art museum. They get about 10% African-American visitation. We get at least 30% white American visitation. People are coming to learn these stories because they want to know the history. And sometimes for like doing an exhibition such as the lynching exhibition, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, looking at these photographs. And I was worried whether it was going to go over. It did. And so it's something, it's about the history. You know what the history is. You talk to the people, and then you go about presenting the information in a way that people can receive it. I'm not trying to make it so that graphs are giants on the wall. They were just, but the information was there, and people read it and gave us feedback. So sometimes we get feedback, this was stupid, on something. But the information basically said, this is a story that needed to be told.
Thank you so much. No, it's fine. I mean, answering whatever you.
So to the woman that talked about tactics, so in that, telling the story may be traumatic and tragic, or even seeing that, and people may feel silenced or don't have the words. So the in the jail, I never ask people what they're there for. I do a restorative class about what needs to happen to navigate these systems that we have mostly, and how do you navigate those kind of things? How do we heal? What's our responsibility? But in soliciting people's freedom, they always have a right to pass. They always have a right to be silent. And I think that's important. But to your point, there's more places than that space to ask their story. And so one tactic is finding different mechanisms for you to engage with them outside. You know, we had these heated debates yesterday, and I thought, like, let me just pull people aside and say, you know, that's a way to hear the story and ask. And the last thing I would say, asking what happened elicits a story. So what happened that you stood up, or what happened that you didn't say anything, is a way and a tactic that we use to have people feel free to speak.
Thank you so much. Time. If people can just quickly, sorry about this answer, then if you have more questions afterwards, engagement is part of it as well.
Okay, I'd like to address Baruti's question, and then I will try to add in Asali, and I'm not sure if your name. But Baruti, I think your question was, how is an Afrocentric word beneficial to students at my school? And I would first just relate it to how, you know, naming of institutions are important to any other you know, identity or background. But specifically, my students, it creates a sense of collectivity, a sense of, you know, identity, a sense of pride, a sense of being a part of something larger than themselves that is important, because many of the students that arrive at Ubuntu Village have been marginalized and disenfranchised in traditional educational settings. And so it's very important for them to feel a part of the classroom and to feel a part of the educational experience. Into that question around how do you make it safe, because that's a huge thing for students to come from a marginalized situation, and then okay, now they're just expected to participate. Well, you know, that's my role, that's my job, that's my task, to create that trust, to create the trust, to create the respect, to create a sense of to move them. That's my greatest reward, to have a student in our space, to see their hesitation, and it's not instant. You know, it happens over time, and you know, they might share a little bit and then a little bit more, and then, you know, it's a process of me feeling that it's like a dance, you know, me honoring and focusing on their strengths and giving them the power. And, you know, each week or each month, it gets to, you know, a little bit more. And now they have transformed. They have literally transformed from being marginalized and silent to being a contributor, a participator that is valued by the community. So that is something. One more thing, if I can, I'd like to share, is the way that I utilize Ubuntu in the how I teach, is that it's, and anyone that is familiar in, you know, in scholarly work, you're familiar with the Cornell note taking, right? And that is something that I utilize at the even earliest third grade. We work on extracting important information, and we study as a community of learners from 3rd through 8th grade. We study each other's notes. We look at how 8th graders take notes. We look at what the 3rd graders, how they are extracting the main ideas, how they are mining for vocabulary. What are their, and this is a responsibility after each note taking, is that they have to have curious questions. And this is where they insert their humanity in the content, because I say that there is no learning without you. You insert yourself. You are a part of this understanding. You are a part of this content. And so I work, you have to model for them. You have to model how to think, how to question, how to interrogate. And so you'll see as you look at the variations of note pages, yes, the third graders' curiosities or questions are on a different level than an eighth grader. But the eighth grader, and we are a community, we are learning from each other. And then also another task in that are their connections and how they make connections with other experiences, other subject matters. And then that's another layer of learning within the community, because now the third graders are like, wow, the eighth grader was able to make this connection, from this, we were actually drawing a mountain slope, but they connected that to math with the X and Y intercept. And then that makes the third grader interested. Well, what is that all about? And so you have this how for me in teaching the Ubuntu, and it creates this sense of community, and it encourages this sense of participation and valuable contributions from all. And that's how their voices end up being raised and honored in the space. Thank you.
I'll be very quick because I have to rush.
Yeah, okay, great.
I'll be very quick because I have to rush back to Cape Town. But the question about silence, I think it needs to be understood in a number of ways. The silence that really irritates me when we're trying to have difficult dialogues is of those who assume they have the knowledge, they've learned enough, so they're just there to observe and give others space and give others voice. That kind of silence is a paternalistic kind of silence. It doesn't allow for dialogue. And also the idea of giving voice is a problem. People claim voice. The other kind of silence that I think you were referencing, that comes from pedagogy, it comes from methodology. So in a lot of our workshops, we do a lot of processes that allow people to find their own voice. And it's very, I'm going to a lot of detail now, but it's Paulo Freirean. So if you know the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, he worked in the most disadvantaged communities, and it was about how do people find their consciousness, how do they become aware, particularly in a political context. So in short, and then very important, Lisa Dalpert, US American writer, was quite important to me when we were studying at university, speaks about the silenced dialogue. And I think that's very important because that talks about this idea of ethnocentrism. You can enter into spaces where the culture of that space silences you. That the moment you represent yourself in a particular way, you either seen as being dumb, as being stupid, or as being disruptive. And that's not only applicable to race. It's becoming more applicable to class, where people just enter into spaces that reek of elitism in a way that silences them. And I'm very concerned about that. Then the issue of Steve Pico, I don't know if I heard your question but properly, but I think to very many people, particularly university students who are activists today, they're rediscovering Pico. And his work has always remained important, not because it completely explains the South African situation, but to my generation, it was important to allow us to engage in dialogue across divided communities, where Black people were divided into a range of ridiculous formal and legal races. And then the way space was organized in the city, our culture, our race became constructed geographically. And so today people are born in those geographic spaces and still see themselves as being part of fixed identities. And so Steve Biko becomes very important in a lot of these dialogues about race today in a way that Mandela is not. Mandela became important when I think the United States entered into the anti-apartheid struggle, you know, which was very late, the same as in the Second World War, at the last stages, when everybody's tired. And at that point, Mandela also proved himself when he refused to be released until all political prisoners were released. I think he really proved himself to the people. But prior to that, the anti-apartheid struggle was driven by very many other intellectuals, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, Robert Sobukwe, Steve Biko. And so a lot of activists today are trying to draw on those multiple sources, but we're constantly being driven back by the Mandela as God idea, you know? And so, yeah, and I'll leave archiving to Geraldine.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Mandy, as well. So your question was basically who decides what to archive / curate, right? Okay, so that is driven by the policies or the collection policies of any museum. So that dictates whatever the museum, the imperative of the museum is in what it collects, that will determine what it archives. So if you have an art museum, that is what it will collect. Some museum like District 6 Museum, which is focused on dispossession and forced removals, that is what the focus will be on for them then. So it's mandated by your collection strategies and your policies, your collection policies. And in terms of curation, my colleague Ulrich is also here, who can also speak to that, and Bongani is here as well, the director of the museum. We have traveling exhibitions, then we have permanent exhibitions. So permanent exhibitions, so curation is really your own subjectivities as a curator that you bring with you, and then you look at what the mandate of the museum is, and you also look at your audience as well, which is often, it's not easy to do because you have your own kind of internal pressures that you have to answer to and balance that with the community or the audience that you are looking to draw in, but that you are also serving. I don't know if that answers your question. It's kind of a textbook answer.
Yeah, literally. So please, if you can engagement. Sorry for overtime. This was great, but thank you everyone. Like ready, and there's an exhibition that is happening. What? Oh, apparently it opens in 5 minutes. Then there's something else afterwards, which we'll discuss at the museum. So thank you so much, everybody, for the space. Okay.